In this video, I'll discuss the features on David Goggin's face that point to very robust lung function and his individualistic nature. Enjoy. Hey there. We've got David Goggins today for our face reading. If you're not familiar with David Goggins, he is very well known in the fitness world. He's a fitness enthusiast, but he's very well known for pushing his mind and body to the limits and then some. He is an ex-Navy SEAL. He's turned into an author now. He's been on the Joe Rogan podcast many times and in the wheelhouse of Joe Rogan's guests that are about lifestyle optimization, mindset, drive, all of that, discipline. He's one of those guys that fits into that puzzle, and he's very well known, and he is a certifiable madman in terms of what he does with his body. So we're going to talk about this because his face has some very, very, very dominant elements that I find incredibly interesting in the context of face reading. So we're going to talk about that. Also, if you're a first-time viewer and you've never seen a face reading before, please pause this and go up here and watch the 5-minute crash course face reading video. Some of the terms and terminology I will use here aren't going to make as much sense as they should if you haven't watched that. So again, first-time viewer, pause this, go watch that. David Goggins. When I was looking at his face, I thought, man, I could do a really deep dive into his face given the strength, the powerful components on his face, but I'm going to do my best to stick to the key features and the things that stand out to me. And also where I'm seeing some leakage and not necessarily in the traditional face reading sense. There's a lens here in Chinese medicine that we're going to talk about. So we'll get into that. First and foremost, the thing that leaps out to me is the dominance of his nose. The nose is the central mountain of the face. It's a metal element feature. The nose and the nostrils can be seen as the external representation of our lungs. Because why? We breathe through the nose. Nasal breathing is optimal for lung function. Yes, we can breathe through our mouth, but there's lots of research to show that mouth breathing is very problematic for facial development. It can lead to allergies. It can actually suppress the immune system, and the lungs relate to the immune system in Chinese medicine. So the nose is really important. And when we see a nose like this, these big nostrils, flared nostrils, the nose points down, the nose tip points down. It has this almost aerodynamic kind of look. My nose that does this to a degree too. If you look at my nose, it has this kind of slightly pointing down. The Estrada side of my family has this nose, and you can see it across all the pictures and all the grandparents and my dad. So with this nose, we want to look at some of the symbolic meaning behind the nose itself on the face. So when we look at the face, the nose ties to individuality. So it ties to a healthy expression of ego. Now, a lot of times in these circles when people are talking about psychology and the ego is sort of lumped in as always collectively bad. Oh, this person has an ego. That's not true. Psychologists, when they look at this, we need an ego. It's there for a reason. It fulfills a part of who and what we are, and it's relevant to living in the world. You just don't want it to run amok. You don't want it to be out of sorts. You don't want it to be excessive. But when we see a dominant nose, a good-looking nose, one like this, what this is a sign of is healthy ego expression. So the nose relates to the ego in general. And if we see a nose that really is long and sticks out, typically this is associated with people who are trailblazing in whatever they're doing. It can also be excessive ego. So when the nose is disproportionate to the face and it really protrudes and it's a huge mountain, this can be a sign of arrogance sometimes as well. And there are features that will balance this out, but you have to realize that people that are full of themselves can have very dominant noses. Now, the other component here that I like to talk about is the symbolic representation of the lungs and the nose. Because his nose is so strong, I want to touch on some key symbolism here out of classical Chinese medicine, which we have not talked about. Chinese culture is really good at using symbols to encode information. They like to have symbols because they stand the test of time. When you have a symbol, that symbol can mean many things in multiple dimensions, and that's the genius and the benefit of basically having symbolic representation in the culture and in the language. So for example, Chinese language is pictographic, what they call Chinese radicals. We've seen the Chinese characters in the writing. So those things, those images, the radicals have multiple symbols within them. They will be a symbol for a house with smoke and maybe water running underneath it, and it relates to perseverance or something like that. So that's an arbitrary example, and I'm not sure that's even true. But what I'm getting at is that the characters will have multiple symbols in them. So the one I do know about is the character for Qi. Qi is rice in the middle of the character with steam coming up above it and a heat source or a heating element below. So what this is pointing to, it's basically a pictographic radical of rice being cooked or rice being transformed. And what that means is what it points to, it's a symbolic representation for the process of Qi is about transformation and the breakdown of something into something else. That's the word for Qi, but it's a picture. So why am I telling you all of this? When we look at lung function, the Chinese encoded the lungs with a specific animal and the behavior of an animal, and that was the white tiger. So they have this image where they say this animalistic-like spirit lives in the lungs. Now, why do they say that? The reason is that the behavior of a tiger and the way tigers behave in the wild is indicative of how humans, we should carry some of those behaviors if our lungs are working well. So they were always looking for parallels in the external world and what's happening in a person. So when I looked at David Goggins' nose, I thought, man, that is a strong lung nose. There is some very, very powerful lung function. And as such, let's talk about what that means. When we see healthy lung function and a nose like this, because that nose is symbolic of the lung function, what does that mean? So I made this image here. I'm going to put it up on the screen. I made this when I was in Chinese medical school. This is a classical representation about healthy expression of the lungs and when the lungs are unwell or when the lungs are sick. So I'm going to read these. So the first one is, okay, when your lungs are in good working order, you're going to see ferocity, acuity of animal instincts, wild, nature-bound, charismatic, commanding respect, bound to the earth, yet yearning for the heavens or for the ethereal, sexual prowess, radiant complexion, naturalness in action, the words are a little small here, imposing nature or posture, natural ability to act, understanding rarity and prizing, and then a general yang quality with a balance of patience and hermetism, brief displays of force, followed by rest and appreciating solitude. Now, the other side, when we are sick, physical weakness, reduced instincts, inability to defend invasive challenges, claustrophobia, lack of self-worth, inability to be a part of society, kind of an outcast, social and financial impotence, clashing clothing, and that's an interesting one because the lungs relate to the exterior, the skin. So when we see mismatched clothing, this is actually a dysfunction in the lungs, which I always found pretty interesting. Poor body language, poor written and verbal skills, superficiality, feeling unattractive, a stickler for rules and structure, dogmatism, disregard for nature, sexually amorphous with the body, shape, clothing, and voice, grouchiness, inability to attract a mate. So I'm reading these to you because we're looking at healthy lung function and unwell or sickly lung function. Now, if you look at the healthy side of this, David Goggins is these things, like to a T. If you look at him and follow his public persona, you know, how he presents himself in the world, he looks a lot like this. And I found that so interesting because he is a person who is a kind of a living expression of healthy lung function according to classical standards, and he's got that really strong nose. So again, I found that fascinating to see his nose, and I also wanted to share this, to give you this idea about the metal element. When you see it dominant on a face like this, this is what we're looking at. So when I'm reading a face, I'm looking at the nose and I'm thinking, oh, good, strong lung function. But because of my Chinese medical background, I can take that one layer deeper. And I just wanted to share it with you all because I think it's pretty interesting. Now, outside of this, the evolution of David Goggins' face. I've talked about this in other videos, but people's faces continue to change as they age. And the reason for that is, yes, as we age, the body continues to grow, right? Things continue to move around, but the nose and the ears particularly continue to grow, and they get bigger as we get older. Now, depending on our lifestyle choices, the things we engage, the integrity of our hormonal system, how well we optimize our hormones, how much growth hormone we allow to spike in our body through fasting and sauna use and diet and sleep and all these things, bones continue to shift and grow. And if you look at David Goggins' face here, there's this little triptych I made of him when he was 300 pounds. So I think David Goggins is about my height. I think he's about 6'2", maybe he's a little bit taller. And he was 300 pounds in this first picture. And this is pre-Navy SEAL training. Then you can see the second picture. This is sort of through his Navy SEAL training. And then the third is when he has gone into the ultra-marathoning, crazy mindset, the madman territory. And if you look at the evolution of his face, for sure, he lost a lot of adipose tissue. He lost a lot of fat. He was in an earth surplus, which changed the features of his face. When we see a lot of extra body fat on a person or on the face, this is earth out of balance. This is excess earth. That's what the definition of fat is, excess earth. And as such, the organs that associate with that element can also become out of whack in the body. So, excess earth taxes the spleen and stomach, which means how you digest, how you transform, all kinds of things are impacted by that. Then you can see he leaned out, and his face, from the top of the head to the bottom of the chin, were similar in proportions from when he was heavy set, but you can see he sort of lost the earth. And then something interesting happens. If you look at his face in this last picture, this is where you can see the wood element has turned on. The wood element is characterized by rectangular shaping, and his skull, his face, and the length of his face got longer. And this is that wood energy, quite literally growth this way, the way a tree would grow. And when we see that wood energy come through, he's got a clean, sharp jaw. He's got a very sinewy, lean constitution now. And you can see from where this picture here, where he was very heavy set, 300 pounds in pre-SEAL training, and then when he became SEAL, this has fundamentally, when we look at someone like this, what we're seeing is this evolution of the wood element. So anytime a person becomes leaner, drops the fat, and we see definition start to come out, we start to see the veins, and we start to get to see the abs, and we see all those things come into the front line, that is wood energy on the rise. And David Goggins has a lot of this. The wood energy also relates to the general archetypally in Chinese medicine. So this tells you where to go, what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. There's a military-like edge to it. Mind you, he was in the military, but also it's the person who says, we ride at dawn. Don't deploy until these missiles have fired, until we do this thing before you make and flank, make your presence known and flank the enemy. It's the general. And his face has this, and he's got these big, dominant cheekbones as well, and you can see those. These are also metal elements. So he's got some sizable metal features, really dominant that way. But again, this points to lung function, and then that symbolic coding of what the lungs mean in the body. His personality really adheres to this in terms of face reading. It's very interesting to see this dominant nose and all the things that are essentially him. Now, this deviates from from face reading. It's part of Chinese medicine. But if you look at his tongue, I found this picture of him with his tongue out. We're not going to do a deep dive into tongue diagnostics, but the tongue is one of the most premier methods of diagnostics in Chinese medical school. You look at the coding of the tongue, the shape, the color, all of those things. There's so much to look at the tongue. And then also pulse taking. And there's different positions. The 3 fingers, when you take the pulse here on both sides, you've got heart, liver, kidney function on one side, lung, spleen, and kidney on the other. And there's gradations of that. And some of the organs are encoded in there. There's more than one. But I'm just illustrating that you can touch the pulses on both sides and get a feel for how the organs are working. Pulse diagnostics take a long time to learn. There's a lot of subtlety and refinement. It's a skill that you practice for many, many years. Anyway, the tongue. You can see when you look at his tongue here, he's got these kind of scallop-like marks on the side of the tongue. This relates to spleen function. The spleen relates to the 4 limbs, the integrity of the 4 limbs and what they go through. David Goggins works his body, I think, excessively. He works way too hard. He runs to the point where his bones have cracked in his shins. He gets blisters, and he just pushes through it. He's all about getting through and putting his body through things that no human is really designed to do, but is able to. He's pushed his mind and then some. But his body is taking a beating. You can also see these cracks along the center of the tongue. That relates to the stomach yin, which means, again, the stomach and spleen are a paired organ system. His tongue, essentially, without getting too deep divey into Chinese medical theory, his spleen and stomach are a bit wrecked. And given the ultramarathon stuff that he does, He's got this yin deficiency, right? The fluids are being burned up. His spleen, that puffy scalloped edges on the side of the tongue mean the spleen, the four limbs are taking an absolute beating. So his tongue really says he needs some work. I would like to get him on some herbs, some medicinal herbs, like Chinese medical herbs. And I would also be telling him to be very careful with how he's treating his body, because, he's got an amazing constitution. He's incredibly strong and he's incredibly fit, but you do have to be careful. There's a taxation. So in terms of lifestyle guidance, and David Goggins would be like, hell no, if I told him this, but I would tell him to slow down. I really would. I would say, find another way to be intense with your body, or do it in a way where you can at least tone down the physicality. But for what it's worth, if he told me to, he blew me off, I would say kind of fair enough too at the same time, because some people decide to do something and we all have free will. We have this choice that like, this is what I'm choosing to do. Now, the last component here about his face that blew my mind was his public persona, his natural face, and his inner persona. Check this out. He has, without question, out of all the faces I've read in the entirety of my face reading career, this man has the most symmetrical face I've ever seen. I sat there and I called my wife in. I said, look at this. Like, this is crazy. So incredibly symmetrical. To be that symmetrical across the board is highly auspicious. That's very lucky in the face reading context. I've said this before with other people when they're pretty close, all three faces. This means David Goggins, who he is on camera, who he is behind closed doors, who he is on stage and off stage are the same person. This is like the pinnacle of where we're trying to get. And the basic idea and all of this stuff is that form and function relate. So if we see this highly symmetrical representation on the left and right side and all faces look like clones, David Goggins is living the dream in terms of being real. And David Goggins, if you watch his content, if you watch him run, you watch him do his things, he's very real and he's crazy and he swears a lot and he's like, stay hard. He's a madman. But his face is symmetrical. It blows my mind. He's just across the board who he is. What you see is what you get. Who he is who he is. So that was something that was very cool. Again, I could do a lot more on David Goggins. He's got a really strong earth mouth, but I'm not going to sit here and do a deep dive on everything about him. But these are the things that stood out. So I hope you enjoyed the reading. If there's someone else you'd like me to read, please let me know. And thanks for your time, as always.